How grateful we are for the beautiful music of Christmas that fills this room and fills our lives and then fills the whole community. We're just grateful for the beautiful music you've brought us this morning. Years ago, more years than I care to remember, when I was a freshman at Northwest Christian College, now Northwest Christian University, but then Northwest Christian College, when I was a freshman there, just beginning my preparation for the ministry, one of the courses that was required of freshman students who were on their way to the ministry was a course entitled Lyric Religion. It was a course designed to teach us something about the place of music in public worship and in private devotion. We did a lot of singing in that class, and we learned to do this kind of thing, Michael, in that class. Some of us were better at it than others. One of the purposes of that class was to make us familiar with a wide variety of hymns. They wanted to increase the repertoire of hymns with which we were familiar. And so we sang a lot of hymns and we memorized the words of a lot of hymns. And one of the first hymns to which we were introduced was a hymn called Angel Voices Ever Singing. And the first verse of that hymn went something like this: Angel voices ever singing round thy throne of grace, angel harps forever ringing, cease not day or night. Thousands only live to bless thee and confess thee night and day. As you might imagine, it was not one of the more popular hymns with that student body, partly because we were children of the 60s, when science had been lifted up to a godlike position, and when it was assumed by both the sacred and the secular world that if we had any faith at all, which was questionable to some people, if we had any faith at all, it would have to be a faith devoid of things like angels and demons and dreams and visions and all things mystical and unseen. But there we were, sophisticated, or so we thought, sophisticated college students being asked to sing this song about angels and their voices and their harps. And not only to sing it, we were asked to memorize all the verses of that hymn. Now, I wonder if you can imagine the atmosphere in the classroom when that assignment was given to us. Eyes rolling back in our heads, deep sighs filling the air, and students as we left the classroom muttering under our breaths, "You gotta be kidding me. What kind of a Mickey Mouse class is this?" But it may be, it just may be, that in our pseudo-sophistication, we were just a little bit too eager to reject all things mystical and unseen. Oh, we wouldn't want to take that hymn that was written in the late 1800s with archaic words to it and included in a modern worship service today. But at least we are able during this Christmas season to attune our ears to the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, who assure us that there are angels all around us. Can we see them? No. Can we touch them? No. Can we put them examine them underneath a microscope? Not at all. But those gospel writers, Matthew and Luke, assure us that there are indeed angels at work all around us, and that these angels are agents of the purposes of God. We aren't called to worship them. We are not even called to go looking for them, because in their own way they will find us, just as they found Joseph in his dreams. But if Matthew and Luke are to be believed, angels are all around us, accomplishing the purposes of God. And according to Matthew and to Luke, one of the jobs of these angels is to serve as agents of transformation. One of their jobs, especially as Matthew tells it, one of their jobs is to transform our fear into something more positive and something more productive. In the case of Joseph, as Matthew tells it, it was the job of the angels to transform his fear into obedience, and his obedience into joy. The angel voices that we sang about in that hymn back there in lyric religion classes are intended to be voices lifting us out of fear and into joy. The basic proof that Joseph was open to the presence of angels in his life is to be found in Joseph's desire to live a life that was a blessing to everybody, not just to Mary, but to everybody. And so, the most important thing the scripture has to tell us about the personality of Joseph is he was unwilling to expose Mary to public disgrace. He wanted to live a life that built people up, that raised people up rather than pushing them down, that enabled people to become everything that they could possibly become. He wanted to believe that people mattered more than anything in the world, and to help them be the best they could be. And that attitude cost Joseph something. For one thing, it required Joseph to disregard, or at least ignore, a piece of scripture that had been a part of his life ever since he was a young man. Do you know what the book of Deuteronomy says was supposed to happen to a woman in Mary's situation? If a woman was betrothed to a man and became pregnant by somebody else, then she was to be taken before the priest in a public religious ceremony and exposed to public disgrace. That is to say, that her betrothal to her fiancé was canceled. All of the responsibilities her fiancé had to her were disregarded. Every responsibility her birth family had to her was laid aside. She was excommunicated from the worshiping community, and in the secular community in which she lived, she was an outcast without hope. And if the priest happened to be in a bad mood that day, he could sentence her to being taken outside the walls of the city and stoned to death. But Joseph was unwilling to expose Mary, or anybody else for that matter, to public disgrace. And I wonder why. He'd learned those verses from Deuteronomy all his life, heard them. Why was he willing not to obey them? Why was he reluctant to expose Mary to public disgrace? I don't know for sure, but I think it was because Joseph understood that there was a commandment in his Hebrew faith that took precedence over the words of Deuteronomy. I think Joseph understood that the greatest commandment in his Hebrew faith was the commandment, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your mind and all your soul, and your neighbor as yourself." I think Joseph understood that that was the best his Hebrew faith had to offer, and that what he wanted more than anything was to live by the best that his Hebrew faith had to offer. And if we take Matthew seriously, we see that the angelic encounter that Joseph had gave him the courage to live by the best the Hebrew faith had to offer. Joseph was unwilling to expose Mary to public disgrace. Living by that commandment is angelic behavior that lifts people's lives out of the depth. It lifts people up rather than pushing people down. It enables people to be all that God intended them to be. Living by that commandment is angelic behavior. Angelic behavior that transforms fear into joy, not only for Mary, not only for Joseph, but for everybody that they encounter. Living by that commandment is angelic behavior that enables us to say that Jesus is Emmanuel, God with us, God for us, God in us, so that not only the angels, but you and I become agents of the purposes of God, transforming fear into joy. It all reminds me of an incident that happened years ago when I was pastoring a church in Spokane. A couple of years ago, when we were having the Lenten series that Mary Ann did for us that year, I shared some of this with some of you. But I was working away in my office there in the church one morning when my secretary put through to me a call from a woman that identified herself to my secretary as a prostitute and asked for me by name. I suppose that explains why my secretary acted a little strange when she passed through that call to me. And I suppose it is incumbent upon me to tell you now that it developed later on that this prostitute got my name out of our church advertisement in the telephone book. I'll tell you that so you won't have to worry about it through the rest of the sermon. Nevertheless, this woman identified herself to me when I came on the line as a prostitute. And she said to me, I want to get out of this life. I've got to get out of this life. It's killing me. Can you help me? Will you help me? Now, as Providence would have it, I happened to have learned just earlier that week about a group of Catholic sisters in our town. My wife worked for them, the Sisters of the Holy Names of Jesus and Mary. But this group of Catholic sisters had started a new program that very week in our community designed to help women get out of the life of prostitution. These blessed sisters had purchased a house which they had turned into a safe house for women wanting to get out of that life. They had gathered together some resources, all kinds of resources to help women in that endeavor. They had searched out and found experts who were able to help these women with their addictions and their behaviors. And some of those sisters actually lived in the house with these prostitutes and trying to give them some strength and encouragement, because it's a hard climb out of that life. Well, I said to this woman who had called me, I'm going to put you on hold for just a moment. We can help you. We will help you. I'll put you on hold while I get it taken care of. I said to my secretary, make those calls, find somebody to go get her and get her to that safe house. And we got her enrolled in the program and all of that. But I didn't want that woman just left on hold, so I had my secretary make those calls while I went back on the line and engaged her in conversation. It was a little difficult because I don't have a great deal of experience conversing with prostitutes. But I said to her, how did you happen to choose our church as the one that you called for help? I'm awfully glad that you did. But our church was located way out on the northwestern edge of the city, nowhere near to downtown where this woman lived and worked. So I said to her, how'd you happen to choose our church? She said, oh, you were not the first church that I called. She said, I called another church. And she named off a large fundamentalist church located closer to downtown, one of those churches that was always crowing about how they were the only Christians in town and the rest of us were all second-class citizens and all of that. And she said, when I called them, they said to me, you get your act together, you get your life on track, and then come and see us. And they hung up on me, she said. I said, that must have been awful. That must have been terrible for you. She said, oh, it was. She said, I cried for 2 hours after they hung up on me. I said, well, it must have taken a great deal of courage for you to make a call to another church after you had that experience and were treated that way. I said, again, how did you choose our church? She said, well, I was looking through the ads for churches in the telephone book, trying to decide who I might call. And I noticed that your church had the word Christian in its name. And I thought maybe you would be. I noticed that your church had the name Christian in its word Christian in its name. And I thought maybe you would be.